Welcome to this journey through one of America's darkest industrial disasters, a tragedy so profound that it was deliberately buried beneath layers of corporate silence and governmental indifference. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of progress and the price paid by those who built our modern world in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a catastrophe that claimed 40 lives in just 30 days, where workers descended into darkness each morning knowing they might never see sunlight again, and left a legacy so disturbing that railroad companies and historians alike conspired to erase it from public memory. It was the year 1912. The Titanic had just sunk in the North Atlantic, sending shockwaves through a world that believed technology had conquered nature. In Washington, President William Howard Taft was campaigning for re-election, while the progressive era promised workplace reforms that would arrive too late for too many. And deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, along the border where coal-rich hollows met limestone ridges, a different kind of disaster was unfolding, one that would unfold not in minutes, but across 31 agonizing days. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel Project, as it would later be known to the few who bothered to remember, was born from ambition and geography. The New River, that ancient waterway that had carved its path through mountains for millennia, possessed tremendous power that the Union Carbide Corporation intended to harness. They envisioned a hydroelectric facility that would supply energy to their electrometallurgical plant, a facility that would process ferrosilicon for steel production, feeding America's insatiable appetite for industrial expansion. But between vision and reality stretched 3 miles of solid mountain. The tunnel would need to cut through Gauley Mountain, bypassing a massive bend in the New River and dropping the water nearly 165 feet to generate electricity. It was an engineering marvel on paper. In practice, it would become a tomb. The Appalachian Mountains in 1912 existed in a peculiar temporal paradox. While cities along the eastern seaboard hummed with electric streetcars and automobiles, while factories in Pittsburgh and Cleveland belched smoke into sky already gray with industrial promise, mountains of West Virginia remained caught between centuries. Gauley Mountain rose from the landscape like the spine of some ancient creature, its ridges dark with oak and hickory, its valleys deep and shadow-filled even at midday. The New River coiled around its base, its waters the color of slate, moving with deceptive calm that hid the tremendous force contained within its current. This was old land, formed during the Paleozoic era, its stones compressed and hardened across hundreds of millions of years. Those stones held a secret. Silica pure, crystalline silicon dioxide comprised nearly 99% of the rock through which the tunnel would bore. This geological fact, known to the engineers who surveyed the route, would prove to be both blessing and curse. The hardness of the silica meant the tunnel walls would be stable, requiring minimal support structures. But that same hardness meant that every blast, every drill, every strike of pick against stone would release clouds of microscopic particles into the air. Particles that, once inhaled, would embed themselves in human lungs like tiny shards of glass. The company knew. Later investigations would reveal that Union Carbide's engineers had tested the rock composition. They had the data. They understood what they were asking men to breathe. And they proceeded anyway, because the alternative wet drilling, proper ventilation, protective equipment would slow progress and increase costs. In the calculus of industrial capitalism, 40 lives were an acceptable expense. The workers who arrived at the Hawk's Nest site in the spring of 1912 came from everywhere and nowhere. They were black men from the Deep South, lured north by promises of $5 a day, a fortune in communities where sharecropping barely kept families alive. They were white men from the surrounding hollows, desperate for any wage as family farms failed and coal mines closed. They were immigrants, Italians, Poles, Hungarians fresh off ships in New York Harbor, directed westward by labor contractors who spoke of opportunity while pocketing recruitment fees. What they found was a company town erected almost overnight. Ramshackle barracks constructed from rough, cut lumber, arranged in segregated rows along the mountainside. A company store where prices for basic supplies consumed most of each week's wages. Foremen who spoke in curses and threats, driving men like cattle into the mountain's depths. The tunnel entrance yawned in the mountainside like a wound. Support timbers framed the opening, raw wood already darkening from moisture and the constant drift of rock dust. Beyond that threshold, the mountains swallowed light completely. In the first 100 feet, daylight faded to gray twilight. Beyond that, absolute darkness reigned, broken only by the inadequate glow of carbide lamps and the intermittent flash of electrical lights strung at irregular intervals along the tunnel's length. The work proceeded in a brutal rhythm. Drilling crews worked in teams, operating pneumatic drills that screamed against stone, the compressed air that powered them adding to the choking atmosphere. The bits churned through rock, pulverizing silica into dust so fine it hung in the air like fog. Behind the drillers came the dynamite men, packing charges into the fresh holes, their work requiring steady hands despite exhaustion and the knowledge that a mistake meant death, quick death from explosion rather than the slow suffocation that awaited in the dust. When the charges blew, the mountain shook. Concussive waves rolled through the tunnel, extinguishing lamps and knocking men from their feet. Rock fragments flew like shrapnel. And then came the dust cloud, thick, choking, absolutely opaque. It would take hours to settle, but the foreman allowed only minutes before driving crews back into the tunnel to begin mucking out the debris. Muckers worked with shovels and wheelbarrows, loading broken rock into mine cars that ran on narrow-gauge tracks toward the entrance. In those early weeks, before anyone acknowledged what was happening, men worked without any protection whatsoever. No masks, no respirators, nothing between their lungs and the crystalline dust that filled every breath. The silica particles were infinitesimal, between 1 and 5 microns in diameter, too small to see individually, small enough to bypass the body's natural defenses, the nose hairs, the mucous membranes, the coughing reflex that expelled larger irritants. These particles traveled deep into the lungs, into the alveoli where oxygen transfers to the bloodstream. There, they embedded themselves in the delicate tissue, causing inflammation and scarring. The medical term is silicosis. The miners called it tunnel consumption, or simply the dust. Within weeks of the project's start, men began coughing. The first death occurred on a Tuesday in early June, just 3 days after the tunnel work commenced. His name was Samuel Harrison, a 32-year-old man from Alabama who had left behind a wife and 4 children to seek better wages in West Virginia. Harrison had been a driller, working the day shift, 10 hours at a stretch in the tunnel's depths. He'd complained to his barracks mates about shortness of breath, about a tightness in his chest that worsened each day, about coughing up phlegm that came away dark with rock dust. He collapsed during the morning shift, falling beside his drill as the pneumatic hammer continued its mechanical scream. By the time his crew carried him to the surface, he was struggling to breathe, his lips tinged blue, his chest heaving with the effort to draw air into lungs that had lost the capacity to process oxygen. The company doctor, a man named Harless, who maintained a small office in one of the barracks buildings, examined Harrison and pronounced it pneumonia. He prescribed rest. There were no hospitals within 20 miles, and the company had no intention of losing a day's work to transport one sick laborer. Samuel Harrison died that night, drowning in his own fluids as his damaged lungs filled with bloody foam. The company listed the cause of death as acute pneumonia and paid his widow $50. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on the mountainside, one of dozens that would be dug in the coming weeks. But Harrison's death was merely the beginning, the first crack in a dam that would soon burst. In the following days, more men began showing symptoms. The coughing became epidemic in the barracks, a chorus of wet, racking sounds that echoed through the night. Men woke gasping for air, their skin clammy with sweat despite the cool mountain temperatures. Some coughed so violently they vomited. Others coughed up blood. The pattern emerged quickly. Drillers and muckers developed symptoms first, their exposure most intense. Support workers, timbermen, track layers, electricians fell ill more slowly. But eventually, everyone who worked in that tunnel breathed the dust. Everyone faced the consequences. Dr. Harless, to his limited credit, began keeping records. His ledger from June 1912 shows a grim progression. June 7th, 3 workers too ill to report for shifts. June 10th, 8 workers hospitalized in barracks. June 14th, 15 workers unable to work, 5 deaths. June 18th, 20, 3 workers showing severe respiratory symptoms. June 21st, 12 deaths in past week alone. The company's response was not to halt work or improve conditions. Instead, foremen increased recruitment efforts, bringing in replacement workers to maintain progress. Union Carbide had deadlines to meet, contracts to fulfill. The tunnel had to be completed. In the depths of the mountain, conditions deteriorated further. The tunnel now extended nearly half a mile into the rock, and ventilation was non-existent. The air hung thick and still, a soup of dust particles that never settled, never cleared. Men worked in clouds so dense they couldn't see their own hands extended at arm's length. The dust coated everything: skin, clothing, tools, lunch pails. Workers emerged from each shift looking like ghosts, covered head to foot in gray, white powder. They called it the White Death. One worker, a man named Thomas Cornett, later provided testimony to investigators about conditions inside the tunnel. His words, preserved in depositions that would remain sealed for decades, painted a picture of industrial hell. You couldn't see nothing in there. The dust was like a solid thing, like you was underwater, but the water was dust. Your lamp wouldn't shine more than a foot or two. You'd be drilling, and the man next to you, you couldn't see him at all. Just hear his drill screaming. When you'd come out at end of shift, you'd cough up mud. Actual mud from your lungs, thick and gray, and sometimes with blood in it. The drilling continued. The blasting continued. The dying continued. By the 3rd week of June, the death toll had reached 22 men. The company's solution was to accelerate night burials, digging graves in a clearing upslope from the barracks and interring bodies with minimal ceremony. Some victims were buried in wooden crates. Others were wrapped in canvas. A few were simply lowered into the earth in their work clothes. No death certificates were issued. No families were notified. The men simply disappeared into the mountain and then into the ground, their lives reduced to entries in Dr. Harless's ledger and deductions from the company payroll. The survivors, those not yet too sick to work, faced an impossible choice: continue working and risk death, or quit and face starvation. Most of these men had traveled hundreds of miles for these jobs. They had no money for return travel, no prospects elsewhere. The company store had extended credit for food and supplies, creating debts that bound workers to the site as surely as chains. So they descended into the tunnel each morning, knowing what awaited them in the dust, choked darkness. Among the workers was a man named Jesse Johnson, 30, 8 years old, who had brought his 2 sons, ages 16 and 19, to work alongside him. All 3 worked as muckers, shoveling broken rock in the dust clouds that followed each dynamite blast. Jesse's younger son, Marcus, developed symptoms first. The teenager began coughing up blood in the 3rd week of June. By week's end, he couldn't stand without support. Jesse Johnson begged the foreman for permission to take his son to a hospital in Fayetteville. The foreman refused, citing the boy's debt to the company store, $37 for food and lodging. Jesse offered to work without pay until the debt was satisfied. The foreman told him if he left the site, all 3 Johnsons would be blacklisted from any mining or construction work in West Virginia. Marcus Johnson died on June 26, 1912. He was the 31st victim of that month. His father and brother, after burying him on the mountainside, returned to work in the tunnel the next day. What choice did they have? The deaths might have continued indefinitely, might have claimed hundreds more lives, if not for one person who refused to accept the company's explanations. A nurse named Catherine Fulton. Fulton worked for a missionary organization that operated a small clinic in Ansted, the nearest town of any size to the tunnel site, about 8 miles distant. She had treated several workers who had managed to make their way to her clinic, men so desperate for medical attention they walked or were carried miles of mountain roads to reach help. What she saw disturbed her profoundly. These men presented with symptoms unlike any pneumonia she'd encountered in 15 years of nursing. The progression was too rapid, the lung damage too severe, and most telling, when these men died, and they all died, their lungs at autopsy were hard and gray, the tissue transformed into something resembling stone. Catherine Fulton began investigating. She traveled to the tunnel site in late June, presenting herself as a visiting nurse conducting a health survey. The company foreman initially refused her entry, but Fulton was persistent and eventually gained access to the barracks. What she found appalled her: dozens of men in various stages of illness, lying in bunks without adequate medical care, some too weak to rise for meals, others delirious with fever as their bodies fought infections their damaged lungs couldn't resist. She examined the company's records and discovered discrepancies. Dr. Harless's ledger showed 33 deaths, but workers told her of more, men who had died and been quickly buried, their names never recorded, their existence erased. She began compiling her own list, interviewing survivors and attempting to reconstruct the true death toll. Fulton also entered the tunnel itself. Against warnings and without the company's knowledge, she accompanied a shift change, walking into the mountain to see conditions firsthand. Years later, she would write about that experience in an article that helped expose the disaster. I have worked in hospitals during influenza epidemics. I have attended victims of mine disasters and industrial accidents, but nothing prepared me for what I witnessed in that tunnel. The air was not air at all, but a suspension of pulverized rock that coated my skin and entered my lungs with each breath. Within minutes I was coughing. The workers, moving through this toxic fog for 10 hours at a stretch, were being slowly suffocated. It was not an accident. It was murder, conducted with full knowledge and deliberate intent. Armed with her documentation, Fulton traveled to Charleston, the state capital, seeking intervention from health authorities. She met with officials from the West Virginia Department of Mines, presenting evidence of the deaths and requesting an immediate inspection of the tunnel site. The bureaucratic response was predictable: forms to file, procedures to follow, inspections scheduled weeks in advance with notice provided to the company. But Fulton's testimony had reached other ears. A young reporter from the Charleston Gazette, a man named Donald Myers, had been present during one of her meetings with state officials. Myers saw a story, a big story, and began his own investigation. On July 3, 1912, the Charleston Gazette ran its first article about conditions at Hawk's Nest Tunnel. The headline read, "Death Tunnel, Workers Die in Droves as Company Drives Mountain Project." Myers's reporting was meticulous and damning. He had interviewed survivors, examined death records or the lack thereof, and consulted with medical experts about silicosis. His article described the dust conditions, the lack of safety equipment, the company's knowledge of the hazards and deliberate decision to proceed without protective measures. The story created immediate uproar. Other newspapers picked up the coverage. Labor organizations began demanding investigations. The West Virginia state legislature received petitions calling for new safety regulations. Union Carbide's response was swift and multifaceted. They denied knowledge of any unusual death rate, claimed all safety protocols were being followed, and filed libel suits against the Charleston Gazette and Donald Myers personally. Simultaneously, they accelerated work in the tunnel, driving crews harder to complete the project before any official inspection could occur. The company also changed tactics regarding workers. Those too sick to continue were offered train tickets home one-way passage back to wherever they'd come from, along with a small cash payment and a document releasing the company from any liability. Desperate and dying, many accepted. They boarded trains south and west, carrying the seeds of their death in their scarred lungs, dispersing before they could testify about what they'd experienced. By mid-July, the tunnel was nearly complete. 2.5 miles had been excavated. The remaining work involved finishing the interior walls and installing the massive pipes that would carry water from the diverted river. Union Carbide brought in new workers, men unaware of what had transpired, to complete these final phases. The dying didn't stop, but it slowed as the dustiest work concluded. Catherine Fulton and Donald Myers continued their investigations, but they encountered resistance at every turn. Medical records disappeared. Workers who agreed to give interviews suddenly became unavailable or retracted their statements. Dr. Harless, the company physician, resigned his position and left West Virginia, taking his ledger with him. A state investigation was eventually conducted in August 1912. Inspectors toured the tunnel, now clean, well ventilated, with the worst of the dust settled or washed away. They interviewed company officials who presented carefully prepared statements about safety protocols and industry standard practices. They examined payroll records that showed minimal employee turnover, with no mention of deaths. The investigators spent 3 days on site and concluded that while working conditions were challenging, there was no evidence of systematic negligence. The investigation's final report, issued in September, acknowledged that some workers may have experienced respiratory difficulties, but attributed this to pre-existing conditions and the natural hardships of underground construction work. It recommended minor improvements to ventilation, but found no grounds for criminal charges or punitive action against Union Carbide. The report was a whitewash, bought and paid for through influence and intimidation, but Fulton and Myers wouldn't let the story die. In the autumn of 1912, Catherine Fulton did something remarkable and dangerous. She began tracking down the workers who had left the tunnel site. She traveled across 3 states, following leads and rumors, finding men who had taken the company's payoff and gone home to die. What she discovered exceeded her worst fears. The death toll hadn't stopped at 40. Men continued dying for months after leaving the tunnel. Their lungs, damaged beyond recovery, gradually failed. Some lingered for a year or more, slowly suffocating. Others succumbed within weeks of returning home, their families never understanding why a husband or father who had seemed healthy when he left for work returned barely able to breathe. Fulton compiled a list of names, 170, 3 men she could definitively confirm had died as a result of their work in Hawk's Nest Tunnel. And she suspected the true number was much higher. Perhaps 200, perhaps more. Many workers had left no records, had no families who could be located, had simply vanished into the anonymous mass of migrant labor that built America's infrastructure. Donald Myers published Fulton's findings in February 1913. The article, titled The White Death, Full Accounting of the Hawk's Nest Tragedy, created renewed controversy. But by then, Union Carbide had completed the tunnel and begun operating their hydroelectric facility. The company was generating revenue, fulfilling contracts, contributing to the local economy through taxes and employment. Politicians who had initially expressed outrage now counseled patience and pragmatism. Labor organizations filed lawsuits, but these were tied up in courts for years, eventually resulting in minimal settlements that provided pittance to survivors and bereaved families. Legal precedents of the era favored corporate defendants, particularly in cases involving workplace safety where workers could be blamed for assuming the risk of dangerous employment. But the Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster had one lasting impact. It catalyzed the movement for workplace safety regulations. Catherine Fulton's testimony, along with mounting evidence from similar disasters at other industrial sites, contributed to the eventual passage of early worker protection laws. The federal government would establish occupational safety standards, though not for decades, not until after thousands more workers had died in similar preventable tragedies. The tunnel itself continues operating to this day. The hydroelectric facility it feeds has been upgraded multiple times, but the original tunnel, that 3-mile bore through Gauley Mountain, remains in use, carrying new river water to generate electricity for the grid that powers homes and businesses across West Virginia. Very few people who benefit from that electricity know its history. The tunnel is rarely mentioned in regional histories. There is no memorial to the men who died excavating it. Their names exist only in scattered records. Catherine Fulton's handwritten lists, a few newspaper articles in archives, deposition transcripts from forgotten lawsuits. The company town that housed the workers has long since vanished. The barracks were torn down within months of the tunnel's completion. The mass graves on the mountainside have been reclaimed by forest, their locations unmarked and now unknown. Nature has erased the visible evidence of what occurred there, but the mountain remembers. Locals in the area, those whose families have lived in these hollows for generations, still speak of the tunnel with unease. They tell stories, perhaps folklore, perhaps something more, of sounds that echo from within on quiet nights, the ghostly scream of pneumatic drills, the thunder of dynamite blasts, the coughing of dead men still choking on dust. Some say that if you stand near the tunnel entrance at certain times, dawn or dusk, when light and shadow blur, you can see them, figures moving in the darkness just beyond the threshold, indistinct, shapes that might be men or might be memory, forever descending into the mountain's depths. The story of Hawk's Nest Tunnel forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about progress and its price. We live in a world built by people whose names we'll never know, whose sacrifices we rarely acknowledge, whose deaths were considered acceptable costs in the grand calculus of industrial development. 40 lives in 1 month, perhaps 200 lives in total, each one a person with dreams and fears, family and hopes. each one suffocated by crystalline dust, while corporations counted profits and government officials looked away. What makes this tragedy particularly haunting is that it was entirely preventable. The technology existed for wet drilling, which suppresses dust. Respirators were available. Proper ventilation could have been installed. Union Carbide knew the dangers. Their engineers had tested the rock and understood the silica content. They made a conscious decision that worker safety was less important than project timelines and cost containment. This calculation wasn't unique to Hawk's Nest. Across America in the early 20th century, similar disasters unfolded with grim regularity. Mining disasters, construction accidents, factory fires, the pattern repeated endlessly. Workers died, companies denied responsibility, investigations were stymied, minimal changes were implemented. Progress, it seemed, required regular blood sacrifices. The 40 deaths in that single month of June 1912 represented the deadliest period of the disaster, but they were merely the visible peak of a mortality curve that extended across years. Men carried the seeds of their death in their lungs, delayed action executions that manifested months or even years after they last breathed the white dust of Gauley Mountain. Catherine Fulton spent the rest of her life advocating for workplace safety regulations and for recognition of silicosis as an occupational disease. She never succeeded in bringing Union Carbide to justice, but her documentation provided crucial evidence for later safety reforms. She died in 1957, having witnessed the creation of occupational health standards that came too late for the men she tried to save, but in time to protect future workers. Donald Myers continued his investigative journalism, exposing other industrial abuses and environmental crimes. He won awards for his reporting, but never forgot Hawk's Nest as his most important and most frustrating story, the one where truth couldn't overcome power. The tunnel itself remains a monument to those deaths, though unmarked as such. Every kilowatt of electricity it generates is, in a sense, powered by the men who gave their lungs, their lives, to excavate it. Their labor, literal and corporeal, was converted into energy that continues flowing long after their names were forgotten. But questions remain, haunting and unanswerable. How many men truly died? The official count was deliberately suppressed. Catherine Fulton's list is likely incomplete. Workers without families, without documentation, migrant laborers whose names were never properly recorded, how many of them lie in unmarked graves on that mountainside? We'll never know. And what of accountability? Union Carbide operated for decades after Hawk's Nest, eventually merging with other corporations. Its assets and liabilities dispersed across corporate entities that still exist today. The company never admitted wrongdoing. No executive faced criminal charges. The civil suits produced settlements that amounted to a rounding error in corporate budgets. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was never served. To this day, the tunnel remains in operation, a functional piece of infrastructure maintained by energy companies that inherited it through successive acquisitions and mergers. Workers service the tunnel regularly, entering its depths to inspect the water pipes and electrical systems. Modern safety regulations require proper ventilation, regular air quality monitoring, and protective equipment. But those workers are following in the footsteps of ghosts. Every time they descend into that 3-mile bore through Gauley Mountain, they walk the path that 170, 3 men or more, walked to their deaths. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through the Appalachian hollows and the New River rushes past the tunnel entrance, local residents report hearing sounds, a rhythmic coughing echoing from within the mountain, the desperate, wet cough of men drowning in open air, their lungs filled with rock dust, suffocating in the darkness while the walls they carved bear witness to their agony. Perhaps it's merely the sound of water dripping in the tunnel, distorted by acoustics and amplified by imagination. Perhaps it's the wind moving through the ventilation shafts, creating harmonics that sound disturbingly like human suffering. Or perhaps the mountain truly does remember, preserving in its ancient stone the echoes of those who died excavating its heart, a permanent record of the price paid for progress. If this journey through one of America's forgotten industrial disasters has moved you, if you find yourself questioning the true cost of the infrastructure we take for granted, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, stories of sacrifice and suffering, of courage and corruption, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Stories that history tried to bury, but that deserve to be examined and remembered. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that extend beyond the tragedy itself to the broader questions of justice, accountability, and the value we place on human life. Comment with your thoughts on how we reconcile our dependence on infrastructure built through suffering, or share any experiences with workplace safety issues in your own life or family history. Until next time, remember that the world we inhabit was built by hands we never knew, and the lights we turn on without thought might be powered by sorrows we've never acknowledged. This is the Untold Hour, where forgotten histories find their voice.